I was standing in my driveway watching the snow fall when Patricia Morrison appeared at the edge of my property line like some sort of middle-aged specter, wrapped in a puffy white coat that somehow made her look even more severe than usual. She was holding her phone up, filming me, which immediately set off alarm bells because nothing good ever came from Patricia filming anything in our subdivision in Boulder, Colorado. "Vincent, we need to talk about the path," she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet morning like a knife. I took a deep breath, already knowing this conversation was going to test every ounce of patience I had left. Patricia was the president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, and in the 2 years since I'd moved into this neighborhood, she'd made it her personal mission to find fault with everything I did. My grass was either too long or too short. My Christmas lights weren't the approved white color. My car was parked 3 inches over some invisible line she decided existed. "What about it?" I asked, leaning on my snow shovel. "You need to clear it. We've had complaints from residents that it's becoming a safety hazard. You're liable if anyone slips and falls." The path she was referring to ran along the side of my property, connecting the main street to the small park area behind our row of houses. For years, everyone assumed it was community property, a shared walkway maintained by the HOA. I'd always thought the same thing when I bought the house, which is why I'd occasionally shoveled it when I was feeling neighborly, though the HOA was supposed to handle communal areas. "Patricia, that's not my responsibility. The HOA maintains common areas. It's in the bylaws." Her face turned a shade of red that clashed terribly with her platinum blonde hair. "That path borders your property, Vincent. Multiple residents have reported that you've been neglecting it. As HOA president, I'm formally notifying you that you have 48 hours to clear the snow and ice, or you'll receive a fine." "A fine? For not maintaining HOA property?" She thrust a paper at me, and I noticed her perfectly manicured nails were painted a bright red. Everything about Patricia screamed that she had nothing better to do than make other people miserable. "This is your official violation notice. The fine starts at $200 and increases by $50 per day until compliance is achieved." I took the paper, scanning it quickly. Sure enough, there it was in neat, typed letters, accusing me of failing to maintain the walkway adjacent to my property and creating a hazardous situation for residents. Below that was a grainy photograph of the snow-covered path with a timestamp from earlier that morning. "This is ridiculous," I said. "I'm not paying for something that isn't my responsibility." Patricia smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "Then I suggest you review your property deed and the HOA covenants." "The board has reviewed both, and we've determined that maintenance of that path falls under your purview as the adjacent property owner. Have a good day, Vincent." She turned and walked away, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, leaving me standing there with a violation notice in one hand and a growing sense of anger in my chest. I looked at the path in question. It was about 4 feet wide, running the entire length of my property, maybe 100 feet or so. Snow had accumulated to about 6 inches, same as everywhere else in the neighborhood. I pulled out my phone and called my friend Derek, who was a real estate attorney in Denver. After explaining the situation, he let out a low whistle. "Man, HOAs are the worst. But technically, if the path is on common ground, they can't force you to maintain it. You need to check your property survey and deed. Do you have those?" I thought back to the closing on my house. "Somewhere in my filing cabinet, probably. I haven't looked at them since I moved in." "Find them. If that path is on HOA property, they don't have a leg to stand on. If it's actually on your property, well, that's different. But either way, don't pay that fine until you know for sure." After hanging up, I spent the next hour digging through my home office files until I found the thick folder from my closing. Inside was a copy of the deed and a basic survey that had been done years ago when the subdivision was first developed. I spread the survey on my kitchen table, trying to make sense of the lines and measurements. The survey was old, done in 2003 when Meadowbrook Heights was built. It showed my property boundaries, but the path wasn't clearly marked. There was a notation about a common area easement, but the exact dimensions were vague. I took photos of everything and sent them to Derek. He called back 20 minutes later. This survey is too general to tell you anything definitive. You need to get a new professional survey done. It'll cost you a few $1,000s, but if you're right about this being HOA property, you can probably sue them for harassment and get your money back. Plus legal fees, $3,000. I looked at the violation notice again. $200 growing by 50 per day. If this dragged on for weeks, I'd be paying way more than the cost of a survey anyway. Do you know anyone? Yeah, I'll text you the contact info for a surveyor we use. Tell him I sent you. He's good and he's fast. That afternoon, I called Mountain Peak Surveying and explained my situation to a guy named Ron Castellano. He had a gruff voice, but seemed sympathetic when I told him about the HOA dispute. Happens more often than you'd think, Ron said. HOAs get confused about property lines all the time, especially in older developments. I can have a crew out there tomorrow morning if you want to pay the rush fee. I agreed immediately. Another $500, but at this point, I just wanted answers. Ron said they'd need about 4 hours to do a complete survey of my property boundaries and prepare a preliminary report. That evening, I shoveled the disputed path anyway. Not because Patricia demanded it, but because I didn't want anyone actually getting hurt. As I worked, my neighbor Tom walked by walking his golden retriever. Heard Patricia got you too, he said, stopping to chat. She's been on a rampage lately. Last week she tried to find the Hendersons because their trash can was visible from the street on a non-pickup day. Never mind that it was because the trash truck missed their house and they were waiting for them to come back. Did they pay? Tom shook his head. They're fighting it, but it's exhausting, you know. Sometimes it's easier to just do whatever she wants and hope she leaves you alone. I thought about that as I finished clearing the path. The problem with that approach was that people like Patricia never left you alone. Give them an inch and they'd take a mile. I'd dealt with enough bullies in my life to know that standing up to them was the only way forward, even if it was harder in the short term. The next morning, right at 8 o'clock, a white truck with Mountain Peak Surveying logos pulled up in front of my house. Ron was a stocky guy in his 50s with a weathered face and a no-nonsense attitude. He had 2 younger guys with him who immediately started unloading equipment. "Vincent Oakley?" Ron asked, extending a hand. "That's me. Thanks for coming out so quickly. Derek's a good friend. Plus, I like these HOA cases. Usually pretty clear-cut once we get the measurements done." He pulled out a tablet and showed me a digital version of my old survey. "We'll be setting up GPS markers and using ground-penetrating radar to locate the original survey stakes. Should be able to tell you pretty definitively where your property lines are." I left them to work and went inside to log into my job. I worked remotely as a software developer, which was one of the reasons I'd chosen Boulder. The tech scene was good, the mountains were beautiful, and I could mostly avoid office politics. I hadn't counted on HOA politics being just as bad. Around 11, I heard a commotion outside. Looking out my window, I saw Patricia's white Mercedes SUV parked on the street. She was standing on the sidewalk, talking animatedly with Ron, who looked remarkably unbothered by whatever she was saying. I grabbed my coat and headed out. "Don't have permission to be here disrupting the neighborhood," Patricia was saying as I approached. "Madam, I have permission from the property owner, which is all I need," Ron replied calmly. "We're conducting a legal survey of his property boundaries." Patricia turned to me. "This is completely unnecessary, Vincent. The HOA has surveyed this area before. Your property lines are clearly established." "Then you won't mind when this survey confirms that," I said. "You're wasting your money on some vendetta. The path is a shared amenity that requires adjacent property owners to maintain their sections. It's been that way since the development was built." Ron cleared his throat. "Actually, madam, that's not quite accurate. Common area maintenance is typically the responsibility of the HOA unless there's a specific easement agreement stating otherwise. And from what I've seen so far, there's some interesting discrepancies between what you think is common area and what the original plat shows." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that the preliminary readings suggest that path isn't on common ground at all. It appears to be entirely within Mr. Oakley's property boundaries." I felt a surge of vindication, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. Patricia, on the other hand, looked like she'd been slapped. "That's impossible. I have the HOA maps right here." She pulled out her phone and started swiping through what I assumed were documents. "The path is clearly marked as common area." Ron shrugged. "Your maps might be wrong, it happens. We'll have the final results in a few hours, and then Mr. Oakley will have certified documentation of his actual property boundaries." Patricia looked at me with an expression that could have frozen the sun. "If you think this gets you out of your obligations, you're mistaken. The HOA will fight this." "Fight what?" "The truth." I couldn't help myself. "Patricia, you came to my house threatening me with fines for not maintaining what you claimed was my responsibility. Now it turns out that the path might actually be my property, which means the HOA has been trespassing on it for years. Maybe you should be worried about your obligations." She opened her mouth, closed it, then spun on her heel and marched back to her car. She pulled away with slightly more speed than was appropriate for a residential street. Tom appeared from his front door across the street, giving me a thumbs up. I waved back, feeling better than I had in days. Ron and his crew finished around 2 in the afternoon. They packed up their equipment, and Ron asked me to come outside so he could show me what they'd found. He had a tablet with a detailed overlay showing my property lines superimposed on a satellite image of the neighborhood. "Here's the situation," Ron said, pointing at the screen. "The path that runs along the side of your house. It's completely on your property. Not partially, not bordering, completely. Your property line actually extends about 6 feet beyond the far edge of the path. The HOA has been treating your land as common area for years." I stared at the image, trying to process what this meant. "So when I bought the house, I actually got more land than I thought." "Exactly. The original survey from 2003 was sloppy. They marked approximate boundaries but didn't do detailed measurements. When the HOA created their maps, they assumed the path was common ground and just drew their property lines accordingly. But according to the recorded deed and the original plat from when this land was subdivided, that whole area belongs to you. Can they claim any rights to it? Like adverse possession or something?" Ron shook his head. "Colorado requires 20 years of continuous, open, and hostile use for adverse possession. The subdivision is only about 22 years old, but the HOA hasn't been using it in a way that would qualify. They haven't been excluding you from it or claiming ownership. They've just been treating it like common ground. Plus, their own documents show they recognized it as common area, not as their property, which actually works against any adverse possession claim. So what do I do now? I'll have the full certified survey report ready by tomorrow afternoon. Once you have that, you'll want to send a copy to the HOA with a letter stating that you're clarifying the property boundaries and that they no longer have permission to treat your land as common area. You might also want to have a lawyer look at whether they owe you anything for years of unauthorized use, but that's up to you. I thanked Ron and paid him the remaining balance. As expensive as it was, it felt like money well spent. I called Derek immediately. So I was right, I told him after explaining what the survey found. Derek laughed. Oh man, Patricia is going to lose her mind. Okay, here's what we do. I'll draft a letter on law firm letterhead putting the HOA on notice about the property boundaries. We'll demand they cease and desist from treating your land as common area, and we'll also address that ridiculous violation notice. Since they were trying to force you to maintain your own property by threatening fines, we can make a case for harassment. You think they'll back down? Depends on how stupid they want to be. Smart HOA boards would apologize, update their records, and move on. But Patricia doesn't strike me as the type to admit she was wrong. She'll probably dig in and make this worse for herself. Derek was right. 2 days later, after I'd received the certified survey report and Derek had sent his letter to the HOA, I got a response. But it wasn't an apology. It was a letter from the HOA's lawyer, a firm called Wellington and Associates, claiming that regardless of property boundaries, the path had been established as a de facto easement through years of community use, and that I couldn't simply revoke access. They're reaching, Derek said when I forwarded him the letter. A de facto easement isn't really a thing in Colorado. They mean prescriptive easement, which has the same requirements as adverse possession. They can't meet that burden. This is just posturing. So what happens now? Now we respond and explain why they're wrong. I'm guessing this goes back and forth a few times before they either give up or decide to file an actual lawsuit, which would be stupid on their part because they'd lose and end up paying your legal fees. The letters went back and forth for 3 weeks. During that time, the HOA held an emergency meeting that I wasn't invited to, despite being a dues-paying member. Tom told me about it afterward. Patricia spent an hour ranting about you, Tom said. She showed everyone the survey results, but kept insisting you were trying to steal community property. A few people pushed back and asked why the HOA maps were wrong in the first place, and she got really defensive. Then she called for a vote to authorize legal action against you. It passed, but barely. A lot of people abstained. That meant the HOA was officially suing me. Sure enough, a week later I was served with papers. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA was filing a lawsuit seeking to establish a prescriptive easement over the path and to force me to maintain it as a condition of that easement. Derek seemed almost gleeful when I told him. They're making this so much easier. We'll countersue for harassment, legal fees, and a declaratory judgment confirming your property rights. Plus, we'll ask for damages for their unauthorized use of your land going back as far as we can document. The legal process moved slowly. There were motions and counter-motions, discovery requests, and depositions. I had to take a day off work to sit in a conference room while the HOA's lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Sandra Wright, asked me questions about when I'd bought the house, what I knew about the property boundaries, and why I was being so difficult about a path that everyone used. I'm not being difficult, I said. I'm standing up for my property rights. Your client tried to fine me for not maintaining my own land while pretending it was common area. When I proved them wrong, They doubled down instead of admitting their mistake. Sandra made some notes and moved on to other questions. During a break, she actually seemed sympathetic. Off the record, I advised the board to settle this early. Between you and me, they don't have a case, but Mrs. Morrison is very insistent. My deposition wasn't the dramatic part, though. That came when it was Patricia's turn. Derek had me sit in on it via video conference since I had the right to be present for testimony in the case. Patricia showed up in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, looking like she was ready for battle. Derek started with basic questions about her role in the HOA, how long she'd been president, and what her responsibilities were. Patricia answered confidently, clearly thinking she was going to dominate this proceeding. Then Derek pulled out a map. "Mrs. Morrison, can you show me where you believed Mr. Oakley's property line was before the recent survey?" Patricia pointed to a line on the map that ran right along the edge of the path. "There. Everyone knows that's where his property ends. And where did you get that information?" "From the HOA records. We have maps of the entire subdivision showing all property boundaries." Derek nodded and produced another document. "These maps correct?" He slid over a copy of the HOA community map. "Yes, exactly." "And where did these maps come from? Who created them?" Patricia hesitated. "They've been part of the HOA record since the beginning." "But who made them? Did the HOA commission a survey?" "I don't know the specific details. They were created when the HOA was formed." Derek smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Mrs. Morrison, I have here the original HOA formation documents from 2003. There's no record of any survey being commissioned. What I do have is an email from the HOA's first president, a man named George Sutherland, saying that he created the community map himself using Google Earth and his best guesses about where properties ended. Would you like to see that email?" Patricia's face went pale. "I wasn't president in 2003. I can't speak to what happened then. But you relied on these maps to determine that Mr. Oakley was responsible for maintaining the path, correct?" The maps showed the path as common area. It was reasonable to assume the adjacent property owner should help maintain it. Except it wasn't common area. It was entirely his property. And instead of checking your facts when he questioned you, you issued violation notices and threatened fines. Why? Because residents were complaining about the path being unsafe. Do you have documentation of these complaints? Another hesitation. They were verbal complaints from whom? I don't recall specifically. Derek let that hang in the air for a moment. "Mrs. Morrison, is it possible that there were no complaints and you simply wanted to force Mr. Oakley to maintain that path because you've had ongoing personal disputes with him?" Sandra objected, and there was a back and forth about the scope of the question. But the damage was done. It was clear from Patricia's reaction that Derek had hit close to the truth. The deposition continued for another hour, with Derek systematically demonstrating that the HOA had no basis for their claims, and that Patricia had acted out of personal animosity rather than legitimate community concerns. By the end, Patricia looked rattled and Sandra looked resigned. 3 weeks after the depositions, Derek called with news. "They want to settle. What are the terms?" "They'll acknowledge that the path is your property, they'll drop the lawsuit and all violations, and they'll pay your legal fees. In exchange, you grant them a permanent easement to use the path as a walkway, with the HOA responsible for maintenance." I thought about it. The vindictive part of me wanted to refuse, to make them suffer through a trial and a complete loss. But the practical part recognized that I didn't actually want to block people from using the path. I just wanted Patricia and the HOA to stop harassing me. "What if I want to fence my property?" I asked. We can put in a clause that you retain the right to install fencing along your property boundaries, but you'll maintain access across the path itself. Basically, you could fence off the rest of your property but not the path, and they maintain it completely. Snow removal repairs everything. It's their responsibility as the easement holder. You'd have zero obligations. Then yes, but I want a formal apology from Patricia in writing. Derek laughed. I'll see what I can do. The final settlement took a few more weeks to hammer out. The HOA agreed to all the terms, including paying nearly $20,000 in legal fees. The apology was harder. Patricia refused at first, but Sandra apparently convinced her that it was a small price to pay to end the litigation. The apology, when it came, was brief and obviously painful for Patricia to write. It acknowledged that the HOA had been mistaken about the property boundaries, and that the violation notices had been issued in error. It stopped short of admitting harassment, but Derek assured me it was enough to protect me if Patricia tried anything similar in the future. On a cold morning in March, almost 4 months after this whole mess started, I stood in my driveway watching a crew install a small brass plaque at the entrance to the path. It read, "Private property of Vincent Oakley, public access granted via easement, maintained by Meadowbrook Heights HOA." Tom came over with 2 cups of coffee. "Congratulations, man, you actually beat the HOA. Thanks." I took the coffee gratefully. I wasn't sure I would for a while there. So what happens to Patricia? That was an interesting question. The HOA board had held another meeting after the settlement was finalized. According to Tom, who'd actually attended this one, there had been some pointed questions about why Patricia had pushed for litigation instead of just accepting the survey results. Several board members had been angry about the wasted legal fees and the embarrassment of losing so badly. "She's still president for now," Tom said. "But there's a recall petition circulating. They need signatures from 30% of residents to trigger a special election." I heard they're already past 25%. I felt a small satisfaction at that. Not because I wanted to destroy Patricia's life, but because actions should have consequences. She'd abused her position to harass me over a personal grudge, and she'd cost the HOA thousands of dollars in the process. The residents deserved better leadership. A week later, the recall petition succeeded. Patricia was removed as HOA president by a vote of 62% to 38%. A retired accountant named Michael Chen was elected to replace her. One of his first acts was to commission a professional survey of all common areas in the subdivision to ensure there were no other boundary disputes lurking. Patricia remained in the neighborhood, though she seemed to leave her house less often. When we did cross paths, she looked right through me like I didn't exist. That was fine with me. Better to be ignored than harassed, but the story didn't quite end there. In April, about a month after Patricia's recall, I noticed some unusual activity at her house. There were several cars parked outside that I didn't recognize, and people were going in and out carrying boxes. I didn't think much of it until Tom came over that evening looking concerned. "Did you hear about Patricia?" he asked. "No, what happened?" "Apparently there's an investigation. Someone looked into the HOA finances after Michael took over, and there are some irregularities. Money that should be in the reserve fund isn't there. Michael called the police." I felt a chill. "How much money are we talking about?" I heard it's over $50,000. Patricia had sole control of the HOA bank accounts as president. No oversight, no co-signers required. The bylaws were set up that way years ago, and no one ever changed them. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged. Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as legitimate community costs. New landscaping that was never installed. Payment to vendors that didn't exist. It had been going on for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The police investigation was thorough. Detectives interviewed board members, reviewed bank statements, and traced payments. I was interviewed too, though I couldn't tell them much beyond my own experiences with Patricia's behavior. In June, Patricia Morrison was arrested and charged with embezzlement and theft. The amounts were significant enough that she was facing felony charges that could result in prison time. Her husband, a quiet man I'd barely ever seen, filed for divorce shortly after the arrest. The HOA held a meeting to discuss the situation. Michael Chen stood at the front of the community center, looking exhausted. We've discovered that Mrs. Morrison embezzled approximately $63,000 over a 3-year period. The police have recovered some of the assets, but we're likely going to need a special assessment to rebuild the reserve fund. I'm sorry to bring you all this news. There were angry murmurs in the crowd. People wanted to know how this had happened, why there weren't safeguards in place, and what was being done to prevent future theft. Michael patiently explained that the board was completely overhauling the financial controls, including requiring multiple signatures on all checks over $500, and bringing in an outside auditor to review the books quarterly. We're also looking at our governing documents, Michael said. The board has too much unchecked authority. We're proposing amendments that will increase transparency and give homeowners more oversight. This should never have happened, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. I left that meeting feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. I'd been right that Patricia was abusing her power, but I'd never imagined it went this far. How many other homeowners had she bullied while systematically stealing from the community? Patricia's criminal case moved through the system slowly. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney's office was unwilling to reduce the charges significantly. In September, nearly a year after this whole thing started with that violation notice about snow removal, Patricia Morrison pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony theft. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution, though given that her husband had divorced her and she'd lost her house in the settlement, it wasn't clear where that money would come from. The HOA would probably never see most of it again. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I'd moved on with my life, focusing on my work and actually enjoying my home for the first time since buying it. The new HOA board was reasonable and responsive. They maintained the path as agreed, promptly handling snow removal and repairs. My interactions with them were minimal and professional. On a snowy morning in December, almost exactly a year after Patricia had first confronted me about the path, I stood in my kitchen drinking coffee and looking out at the same scene that had started everything. The path was clear, shoveled by the HOA's contracted service. Kids were using it to access the park, laughing and throwing snowballs. My phone rang. It was Derek. "Hey Vincent, just wanted to give you a heads up. I got a call from the State Bar Association. They're investigating Wellington and Associates for their role in the HOA lawsuit." Apparently, Sandra Wright knew about the embezzlement before the suit was filed and didn't disclose it. There's a whole thing about legal ethics and knowingly filing frivolous suits. Wow. I almost feel bad for Sandra. She seemed like she didn't want to be involved. Yeah, well, she made her choice. If you know your client is stealing money and abusing their position, you don't help them file harassment lawsuits. She could lose her license over this. After hanging up, I thought about the chain of events that had led from a simple dispute over snow removal to criminal charges and ethics investigations. If Patricia had just admitted she was wrong about the property line, none of this would have happened. The embezzlement might have continued undiscovered. She'd ultimately been undone by her own inability to back down. I never saw Patricia again. Tom told me she was released on parole after serving 16 months, but she moved out of state immediately. Her ex-husband had sold their house and moved to Arizona. It was like she'd never existed, except for the cautionary tale she'd left behind. The brass plaque remained at the entrance to my path, a permanent reminder of the dispute that had changed everything. Sometimes new residents would ask me about it, and I'd give them the abbreviated version of the story. Most people found it hard to believe that an HOA president would go to such lengths over something so petty. But I'd learned an important lesson through all of this. Standing up for yourself mattered. It was tempting to just give in to unreasonable demands, to pay the fine and move on, to avoid conflict. But bullies counted on that temptation. They relied on people being too tired or too busy or too conflict-averse to fight back. By refusing to back down, by insisting on the truth and being willing to invest time and money in proving I was right, I hadn't just won my own battle. I'd exposed corruption that was hurting the entire community. The new HOA leadership was better. The financial controls were stronger. Other homeowners felt more empowered to question decisions and demand accountability. Michael Chen proved to be exactly the kind of president the community needed. He was transparent, approachable, and focused on actual problems rather than petty rule enforcement. Under his leadership, the HOA updated its bylaws to require regular audits, term limits for board members, and regular community meetings where homeowners could voice concerns. In February, a year after the settlement, Michael stopped by my house with some paperwork. "I wanted to give you this personally," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a check for $3,000, the cost of my original survey. "The board voted to reimburse you for the expense that started this whole thing. We also wanted to thank you. If you hadn't pushed back against Patricia, we might never have discovered what she was doing. You probably saved the HOA from even greater losses." I was genuinely touched. "Thank you, Michael. This means a lot. We also wanted to ask if you'd consider joining the board. We have an opening, and we need people who aren't afraid to ask hard questions and stand up for what's right." I thought about it for a moment. The idea of being part of an HOA board wasn't exactly appealing after everything I'd been through. But Michael was right that they needed people willing to provide oversight and prevent future abuse. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. The election isn't until April. Just let me know." That evening, I walked the path that had caused so much trouble. It was well maintained now, the pavement clear of ice and snow, small solar lights marking the edges for safety at night. It was actually a nice amenity, connecting the neighborhood in a way that brought people together rather than driving them apart. I thought about Patricia, sitting in prison somewhere, her life destroyed by her own choices. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't regret my role in it either. She'd broken the law and hurt people. Consequences were appropriate. I thought about Sandra Wright, the lawyer who'd made the wrong, ethical choice and was now facing the consequences. About how easy it is to rationalize bad behavior, to tell yourself you're just doing your job or following orders. And I thought about all the small battles people face every day against petty tyrants and unreasonable authorities. How many people just gave in because fighting seemed too hard? How many injustices went unchallenged because standing up felt too risky or expensive or exhausting? My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Heard Michael asked you to join the board. You should do it. We need someone who gives a damn. Maybe he was right. The HOA didn't have to be an oppressive force. It could actually serve the community, maintain common areas, organize events, and help neighbors connect with each other. But that only happened when good people were willing to step up and do the work. I texted back, "I'll think about it." The snow was falling again, light flakes drifting down in the streetlights. I stood at the edge of my property, looking at that brass plaque. Private property but open for public use. A compromise that worked because it was based on truth and fairness rather than power and intimidation. In April, I ran for the HOA board and won easily. My first act was to propose a resolution establishing clear standards for when the HOA could issue violations, including requiring photographic evidence, written complaints, and a review process before fines were assessed. It passed unanimously. My second act was to organize a community barbecue in the park, using the path that had started everything as the main route for people to access the event. Nearly every household showed up. People brought food, kids played, and neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other before started forming connections. Tom came up to me while I was manning the grill. "This is what an HOA should be, bringing people together, not tearing them apart." I flipped a burger and nodded. It takes work, though. Constant vigilance. The moment people stop paying attention, you get another Patricia. True. But now we know what to look for, and we've got good people on the board who won't let it happen again. As the sun set and the party continued with string lights illuminating the park, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. My home felt like home. My neighborhood felt like a community. And that path, the one that had caused so much conflict, was full of people walking back and forth, laughing and talking, enjoying a spring evening together. It turned out that standing up for yourself could do more than just solve your own problems. It could make things better for everyone. You just had to be willing to fight for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it cost you time and money and stress. The brass plaque remained, but it stopped being a symbol of conflict. Instead, it became a reminder that truth matters, that boundaries should be respected, and that communities work best when they're built on honesty and fairness rather than arbitrary authority. Patricia Morrison had tried to make my life difficult over snow removal on a path she wrongly believed was shared property. In doing so, she'd set off a chain of events that exposed her crimes, reformed the HOA, and ultimately made Meadowbrook Heights a better place to live. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest disputes. Sometimes standing your ground over something seemingly trivial opens the door to addressing much larger problems. And sometimes, a fight over snow removal turns out to be about something much more important than property lines or maintenance responsibilities. It was about respect, accountability, and the kind of community we wanted to live in. And in the end, despite all the stress and conflict and expense, I was glad I'd fought that fight. Because now I lived in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other, where the HOA served the residents instead of harassing them, and where a simple path through the snow connected us all.